"Can you cook?" The question came from the road above her. Clara Wren kept one knee in the dust and one hand inside the frozen weeds, searching for anything that still looked like food. She had found 3 hard rose hips, 2 shriveled chokecherries, and 1 thorn buried deep enough in her thumb to make her feel awake. The horse snorted. The man in the saddle waited. "I asked you a plain question," he said. "Can you cook?" Clara did not turn around yet. "That depends on whether you mean supper or survival." The rider said nothing. Clara pulled the last red berry from the briars and put it on her tongue. It was bitter, dry, and mostly seed. She chewed anyway, not because it helped, because hunger was already watching her, and she refused to let it see her beg. Only then did she stand. The man on the horse was Jonah Bell, owner of the Bell Fork Ranch, 22 miles beyond Mercy Flats, where the sage turned thin and the creek froze before breakfast. His eyes moved over her coat, patched at both elbows, her boots, one heel split open, the canvas bundle in her arms tied with stove string. Everything Clara owned was inside it. A tin measuring cup, a cracked-handled knife, a flour sack towel, her mother's receipt book, and a little brown ledger with more arithmetic than recipes. Everything else had gone at auction after the fever took her mother in September. The cook stove, the milk goat, the room behind the dry goods store where Clara had slept for 17 years. Jonah Bell did not offer pity. He did not ask how far she had walked. He looked toward the gray line of clouds gathering above the prairie and said, "I've got 15 men coming in from the outer leases. Last cook left before first frost." Clara lifted her chin. "If your stove draws, your flour is dry, and nobody has spoiled the water barrel," she said. "I can feed them." Jonah studied her for another beat. Then he turned the horse slightly. "Climb up." Clara shook her head. "My legs still answer. Not well. Well enough." She adjusted the bundle under her arm. "Point me toward your kitchen." The Bell Fork Ranch looked strong from the ridge. That was the first lie. The main house sat square against the wind. The bunkhouse roof sagged a little, but not enough to scare a man. Corals stitched the lower pasture in dark lines. A smokehouse leaned near the creek, and behind it a row of cottonwoods rattled their bare branches like bones. From a distance, Bell Fork looked ready for winter. From the kitchen door, it looked like a place quietly losing the argument. Smoke hung under the rafters. The stovepipe wore a black ring where soot had leaked through the seam. Ash packed so high beneath the grate that fresh coals had nowhere to breathe. The flour sacks leaned against the north wall, exactly where the frost sweated through the boards. A slab of bacon hung too near the stove. The coffee pot had a crust at the bottom thick enough to scrape with a knife, and in the root bin, potatoes were beginning to give off that sweet, sick smell Clara knew too well. This was not filth, it was worse. It was carelessness repeated until everyone began calling it normal. Jonah watched her take it in. He saw a poor girl staring at a messy kitchen. Clara saw a system that was about to fail. She set her bundle on the table. "Do you have 2 pails? 2 pails? And lye soap. Vinegar if there's any. Rags, a stove scraper, dry split wood, and a strip of cheesecloth about 6 inches long." A dry laugh came from the doorway. Amos Cade, the old camp cook who had been helping since spring, leaned against the frame with one shoulder and a full measure of contempt. "Men want meat," he said, "not a girl waving cloth at a stove." Clara did not look at him. She opened the firebox, cleared the packed ash down to a thin bed, and held the strip of cheesecloth near the mouth. It lifted, then sagged, then trembled sideways. "The fire isn't weak," she said. It's confused. Amos barked another laugh. Clara kept watching the cloth. The draft is broken at the throat. Soot in the pipe. Too much ash below. Damp wood. You're not cooking with fire in here. You're rustling smoke. The room went still for half a second. Not because anyone believed her. Because nobody had heard a kitchen spoken of like it had a mind. By noon she had the stove scraped, the ash thinned, and the pipe seam packed tight enough to hold. By 3, beans were swelling in pork broth. By sundown, the first pan of biscuits came out wrong. The tops were brown, the centers stuck like paste. Amos grinned wide enough for the bunkhouse to see. Clara broke one open, touched the wet middle, and reached for her ledger. Hot mouth, dead back, too much ash, under left grate. She wrote it down. Then she made the second pan smaller, shifted the coals, and turned the skillet halfway through. The next biscuit split clean. Jonah took one. He said nothing. He ate it standing beside the table. Then he reached for another. That was the first vote Clara needed. By the next evening, the 15 men were back from the outer leases, stiff with cold and expecting the usual punishment. Scorched coffee, salt pork fried hard as boot leather, bread that could crack a tooth. Instead, they got bean stew thick with onion, corn cakes hot from the skillet, coffee that tasted like coffee, and stewed apples warmed with a shaving of bacon fat. Nobody praised her. Cowhands rarely spent words where chewing would do. But bowls came back empty. Mugs went out full and returned asking for more, and after supper, Clara set 3 pails near the washbench, one for peelings, one for bread ends, one for sour milk and drippings. Tate Lyle, the foreman, watched from near the door. "Saving trash?" he asked. Clara tied the apron strings tighter. "Counting tomorrow." At the far end of the room, old Hiram Vetch, who had survived winters that killed better men, nodded once. "Girl ain't just filling bellies," he murmured. "She's buying days." The following morning, Clara did not start in the kitchen. She started below it. The pantry was worse than the stove. 43 pounds of flour sat in 2 sacks against the frost wall. 84 pounds of beans rested straight on the floorboards. The cornmeal was open at the top. The salt barrel had crusted around the rim. Onions were buried under potatoes where one soft one could poison a whole bin. She touched nothing at first. She only looked. Then she divided the room into 3 worlds. Dry goods away from walls. Roots in the cool corner, but not the wet one. Meat and herbs where air could move. She had cut scrap willow into runners, and by dusk every sack stood 8 inches above the floor. Amos watched with his arms folded. Those sacks been there since May. Clara reached into the lower corner of the flour and pressed. The cloth came back damp. "May is not coming to save us." For once, Amos had no answer. That night, Jonah passed the pantry door and stopped. Clara had the little ledger open under a lamp. He expected recipes. Instead, he saw columns. Flour remaining, beans remaining, cornmeal, bacon, coffee, rendered fat, mouths fed, meals stretched. Possible days snowed in. He looked at her differently then, not softer, more carefully. The next morning, Clara noticed the cattle nobody wanted to name. 10 young heifers stood in the lower pen. They were not dying. That was the dangerous part. Dying animals make men act. Thin animals only make men hope. Their hips showed under dull winter coats, and they chewed as though every mouthful had to be argued into the body. Jonah stood beside the fence with a folded letter in his hand. "Credit man says, sell them before the road's close," he said. "We're short near 17 tons of hay, if January turns cruel." Clara glanced at the letter. The offer was low, low enough to be insulting, high enough to sound sensible. She did not argue. She went back to the kitchen and filled a pail with bread ends, wheat bran, sour milk, potato water, and a pinch of salt. The first mash was wrong. Too soupy. 2 heifers sniffed it and walked away. Clara wrote in the ledger, less water, more bran, feed warm, feed twice. The next morning 4 heifers lowered their heads. The next evening 7 did. On the third day, the smallest one, a red-backed animal with frost on her lashes, stepped forward last. Clara stood still. The heifer took 1 mouthful. Then another. No one celebrated. But Tate saw it. Hiram saw it. Jonah saw Clara close the ledger as if a small door had just held against a storm. By early November, the basin began giving warnings most men mistook for weather. The pump handle glazed white before dawn. The creek iced at the edges, then stayed iced at noon. The smoke from the kitchen chimney no longer rose straight. It flattened, slid along the roof, and crawled toward the east before disappearing. Clara wrote 1 line. November 6, north wind sitting low. That afternoon, a neighbor named Orrin Hask wrote in laughing. He found Clara weighing flour, checking bacon, and counting kindling pieces no thicker than a man's thumb. Cold comes every year, Orrin said. You meet it with beef, firewood, and a good rifle. Clara's eyes stayed on the smoke scraping the shingles. Orrin kept laughing. Hiram did not. Old men who had listened to winter long enough knew it never raised its voice before it struck. 3 nights later, the stove threw smoke back into the room. It came first as a breath, then a wave, then a bitter gray flood that sent the men coughing from the table. Jonah flung the back door open, and freezing air cut through the kitchen. Amos stabbed a finger toward Clara. There. You cleaned the stove to death. Clara reached for the cheesecloth. She held it at the firebox. The cloth pushed backward. Not sagged, not fluttered, pushed. She went outside with no coat buttoned, stared up at the chimney, then toward the line of cottonwoods where the north wind broke over the roof and drove down across the flue. When she came back, her cheeks were red from cold. The stove isn't ruined, she said. The chimney is cold, the wind is heavier than the draft. Amos scoffed. Clara rolled a twist of paper, lit it, and held the flame up inside the flue. Warmed the pipe first, small sticks after. Door closed quick, then heavier wood. Every man in the kitchen watched her rebuild the fire. Small fuel. Quick door. Hot twist in the flue. A breath of hesitation. Then the smoke turned. It lifted clean and vanished up the pipe. Nobody cheered. Amos did not apologize. But that evening, before he went to bed, he split a stack of kindling small enough to fit Clara's rule. He left it beside the stove without a word. On the frontier, shame often arrived disguised as usefulness. November settled in hard. The kitchen changed first, then the ranch. Coffee stopped tasting burnt. Bread stopped going stale because there was less of it, and better use for what remained. Stew filled men without stuffing them dull. Tate noticed fewer quarrels in the bunkhouse after supper. Jonah noticed fewer mistakes in the cattle work before breakfast. Hiram noticed the kindling pile growing every evening without anybody asking. Clara noticed all of it, but she said little. Trust out there did not come in speeches. It came in a fixed latch on the cellar door, a new shelf along the pantry wall, a covered plate left warm for a rider returning late from fence line. One night Jonah came in after dark, coat white at the shoulders. A plate waited near the stove. Not dried out, not boiled twice. Warm. He ate standing alone while the house slept. The next morning, Clara found a new hook nailed near the pantry door, high enough to hang bacon away from the stove heat, and low enough that she could reach it. She looked toward the barn. Jonah was already pretending to adjust a harness. At dinner, his piece of apple slump was larger than the others. Not much. Enough. Then Eben Quill arrived. He came in a black buggy with brass lamps and wheels too clean for Belfork mud. He worked for the Territorial Cattle and Credit Office in Laramie, and he wore the kind of wool coat that made poverty feel like a personal mistake. He entered the dining room with gloves still on. The men had just finished eating. Bowls sat on the table. Eben laid his papers among them as if paper outranked bread. "The spring balance stands at $610, he said. "Feed costs are rising, winter beef prices are falling, and your note comes due before calving season." Jonah remained standing. Eben looked toward the lower pen. "My advice is simple. Sell the 10 heifers now. Reduce your debt before snow makes sentiment expensive." He smiled just enough to be heard. "You're a capable cattleman, Mr. Bell. But cattlemen often mistake hope for arithmetic." Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, hands dusted with flour. Eben glanced at her once. The cook needn't concern herself with credit. The room went so quiet, the lamp flame seemed loud. A flake of dough dropped from Clara's wrist to the floor. Jonah looked at the papers. Then he looked at Clara. He did not ask her to speak. He pulled out the chair beside him. That was all. Clara walked to the table and set down her brown ledger. Its cover was soft from use. Its pages smelled faintly of flour, smoke, and lamp oil. She opened it, not to a recipe, to numbers. 10 heifers. 31 days on warm mash, hay remaining, kitchen scraps saved, bran stretched, average feed reduced without weight loss, meals for 16 people, 11 storm days without outside supplies. Eben's expression sharpened. Clara put one finger beside a column. "If we sell now, the debt shrinks once." She moved her finger down. "If they live to spring, the herd grows every year." Another line. "These animals are not beef yet. They're tomorrow's calves." Eben gave a thin laugh. Kitchen arithmetic. From the end of the table, Hiram spoke for the first time. Only kind of blizzard respects. Nobody moved. Eben looked at the ledger again. For the first time since he had entered Belfork, he could not pretend Clara was furniture. He slid the sale agreement forward. "If the road's close, and those heifers die, the office will not soften the note." Jonah looked at the paper, then at the window where the lower pen darkened under a hard blue evening, then at Clara's ledger. "We keep them," he said. No speech followed. It did not need one. The words landed like a bar, dropped across a gate. Eben gathered his papers. "Winter will decide whether you chose wisdom or pride." Clara closed the ledger. Then she went back to the stove, lifted the kettle lid, and added one more piece of bacon to the broth. Because winning an argument had never fed a ranch, work did. After Eben left, Clara built what she called the storm kitchen. Hard biscuits baked twice until they rang against the pan. Broth reduced into jars of thick jelly. Tallow cakes wrapped in clean cloth. Coffee boiled down into a dark syrup that could wake a man with half the grounds. Potato water saved for mash. Bean liquor saved for soup. Nothing was made for comfort. Everything was made to last. Near the pantry door she hung a board and marked 6 lines in charcoal. Flour, beans, cornmeal, bacon, coffee, fat. Every night she changed the numbers. Not for what had been cooked, for what remained. Tate moved hay closer to the lower pen before the wagon track disappeared. Feed sacks were lifted onto runners. Canvas covered the tops but not the sides. "Let air pass," Clara told him. "Covered things can still rot." He nodded without a joke. Even Amos changed. He did not admit it. He simply began making the kindling pile before Clara could ask. A man like Amos could not say he was wrong, but he could split wood thin enough to prove he had listened. One night, near midnight, the ranch dog started barking toward the lower pen. Not once. Again and again. Clara was already pulling on her coat when Tate lifted the lantern. They found the smallest red-backed heifer tangled against the fence, rope twisted around one hind leg, wind striking her broadside. Another hour, and she would have gone down. Tate cut the rope. Clara pressed both hands against the heifer's neck and felt for warmth. Small. Shaking. Still there. They moved her behind the haystack, where the wind broke over instead of through her. Clara stood with one hand on the animal until the trembling slowed. Jonah watched her in the lantern light. She was not gentle in a soft way. She was gentle the way a good roof is gentle, by being ready before the storm arrives. January came without mercy. For 5 days, snow fell straight. On the 6th, the wind found it. The world vanished. Sky, ground, fence, road, creek, all of it turned into one white wall moving sideways. Men tied rope from house to bunkhouse. The pump froze. The barn door had to be dug open every morning. A walk to the haystack felt like entering a mouth full of knives. Nobody wasted steps. Nobody wasted fire. Inside, Clara's storm schedule took over. Hard biscuits before dawn. Broth for hands too cold to close. Coffee syrup stretched with hot water. Beans thickened with cornmeal. Small fires built fast and shut tight. The stove did not smoke back once. Every sack in the pantry stayed dry. Every root bin breathed. Every morning the 10 heifers crowded into the lee of the haystack and ate warm mash before hay. Even the red-backed one stayed standing. On the 7th morning, a man stumbled into the yard out of the white. It was one of Orrin Hask's hands. His beard had frozen into a mask. "Need broth," he gasped. 2 men fevered. "Can't chew beef." He looked toward the pen. "And the weak cattle won't touch hay." Clara filled a kettle. Then she mixed a pail of mash in front of him. Bran sour milk, warm potato water, pinch of salt, small feedings, often. The man watched as if she were loading a rifle. Behind her, Amos laid another armful of thin kindling beside the stove. He did not look at Clara. He did not need to. That was the apology. 2 days later, Orrin himself came through the easing snow. His face was raw with cold. No laughter rode with him this time. "Our flour spoiled," he said at the kitchen door. North wall sweated through. "Lost half a sack." He swallowed. "How high do you raise yours?" Clara tore a strip from a brown paper wrapper. She wrote only what mattered. 8 inches off the floor. Air under every sack. Dry wall, not cold wall. Do not seal canvas tight. She folded the paper once and handed it to him. Orrin took it with both hands. Not like a scrap. Like a receipt for staying alive. The frontier settled arguments that pride could not. It did not shout. It thawed the evidence slowly and made everyone look. When the road opened, Eben Quill returned. He expected ruin. He found 10 heifers on their feet. Not fat, not pretty, alive. Their coats had begun to shine beneath the winter roughness. Their heads lowered into the trough without fear. The red-backed one shoved another animal aside to reach the warm mash. Eben stood at the fence longer than he meant to. Inside the house, Jonah placed 2 ledgers on the dining table. One from the credit office, one from Clara. The debt was still real. Winter was still real. But beside Clara's columns now sat new ones. Expected spring calf contracts. Projected breeding value, feed saved through waste control. Losses avoided. Days isolated. Animals still standing. Eben read the pages. Then he looked out the window. The heifers were eating in the snow. Clara stepped forward only once. She opened the ledger to the final page and placed one flour-dusted finger beside 3 words. Still on feet, no speech could improve it. Eben removed his gloves. That was the first respectful thing he had done in Bell Fork. He tapped his own papers, but the sound had lost its authority. "Your note remains due," he said. Jonah nodded. "It will be paid." Eben looked again at Clara's ledger. For the first time, the credit office had measured a ranch and missed the part that mattered. Not land. Not cattle. Not paper. Preparation. That night, after the lamps burned low, Jonah sat alone in the kitchen. The stove was clean, the pantry door latched. A neat row of thin kindling waited by the hearth. Clara's ledger rested under the lamp. He laid one hand on its cover. Months earlier, he had seen a starving woman beside a road and believed he was hiring a cook. He had been wrong. He had brought home the person who taught the ranch how to survive its own habits. At dawn, he found Clara on the porch, watching sun strike the snow so bright it hurt the eyes. For a while, neither spoke. Then Jonah said, "I asked if you could cook." Clara kept looking at the creek. "You did. You kept this place standing." She looked at him then. Jonah's voice was quiet. "I want you to stay through spring, then summer, then as long as Bell Fork has a name on a gate." Clara studied him. "Running the kitchen? No." He glanced toward the pantry window. "Running what keeps the kitchen from being the only thing that works." Clara was silent. Then she asked, "Will the sacks stay off the floor?" A smile moved across Jonah's face before he could stop it. 8 inches, and the kindling, thumb thick, and nobody hangs bacon over stove heat, not twice. Clara nodded once. That was enough. Some frontier partnerships were never sealed with rings, speeches, or grand promises. Some began with a shelf raised above damp boards. 4 winters passed. Bell Fork still froze every January. The wind did not become kinder. The creek did not stop icing before sunrise. Only the ranch changed. Storm biscuits were baked before Christmas. Broth jars waited before the first hard blow. Flour stood on runners in the driest corner. The kindling pile stayed thumb-thick. The 10 heifers became the foundation of a herd that paid more in 4 calving seasons than the credit office had ever offered in one frightened sale. Orrin Hask sent young hands to Bell Fork each November to learn how to keep flour dry, feed weak cattle, and red chimney smoke. Amos never called Clara right. He simply taught the boys to hold cheesecloth to the stove mouth before blaming the fire. One cold evening, Jonah came into the kitchen carrying a small cloth pouch. He set it on the table. Clara untied the string. Inside lay a handful of dried rose hips and chokecherries. Hard, red, bitter-looking. For a moment she was back on the road outside Mercy Flats, chewing hunger down one seed at a time while a man on a horse asked a question too small for what it would become. "Can you cook?" By then, every person at Bell Fork knew the answer. Clara Wren had not merely put food on the table. She had taught a ranch to think before winter started counting.